The note was small, folded twice, the paper worn soft at the creases from handling, and it sat on the library shelf between two volumes of botanical illustration, as though it had been placed there in a moment of private intention and never retrieved. Miriam found it on a Tuesday morning in late November, when the light through the east windows was the pale, uncertain grey of a sky deciding whether to snow. She almost did not open it. She had learned in the 2 months since her arrival at Crestfield that the things left behind in this house were not always meant for her eyes. She opened it. There were only 3 lines. The handwriting was careful and feminine, each letter formed with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had been taught that a letter reflected its writer's character. The first line was a date. The second was an observation about the library's collection of natural history. And the third line contained her name, not her family name, her given name, Miriam. She stood with the note in her hands and felt the cold press of the stone floor through the thin soles of her half-boots. And she understood that some things take a very long time to become clear. This was one of them. She folded the note and placed it inside the cover of the nearest volume, and then she went down to breakfast and said nothing to anyone. But she kept thinking of the name. She had been thinking of it still 2 hours later, when she took her place at the long table in the morning room and waited for Lady Ashford to finish speaking. Miriam Holt had come to Crestfield Estate in late September, travelling the last 12 miles in a hired conveyance that smelled of damp wool and previous occupants. She had 1 trunk, 2 hat boxes, and a letter from her father addressed to Lady Ashford, written in the careful hand of a man who was embarrassed by what he was asking. Her father, George Holt, was a clergyman in modest circumstances whose circumstances had grown rather less modest after a series of poor decisions across 3 years of quarterly rents going unmet. The debt had accumulated to £40 owed to the Ashford estate, a sum he could not produce without stripping the rectory of things that had belonged to Miriam's mother. Lady Ashford had offered a resolution. Miriam would serve as the lady's companion for 6 months. The debt would be considered settled at the arrangement's close. Her father had presented this as a fortunate outcome. Miriam had listened to his explanation with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window, watching the autumn orchard, and she had said that she understood, which was not the same as saying she agreed, but she had packed her trunk, folded her mother's shawl on top of everything else, and gone. Crestfield was a large house in the Derbyshire manor, 3 stories of pale stone set back from a formal approach of old limes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pendle, had met her at the door, taken 1 look at the hired conveyance, and decided something that she kept to herself. She showed Miriam to a room at the end of the east corridor, a room with a good view of the kitchen garden and a fireplace that drew cleanly. She said, with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who has assessed a situation and made her peace with it, that Miriam would find the library well stocked if she cared for reading, and that the kitchen would send up a tray if she wished to rest, before presenting herself to Lady Ashford. Miriam thanked her and went to the window instead and looked out at the kitchen garden, where a man in a worn brown coat was working the last of the autumn beds, turning soil in the cold morning with the unhurried precision of someone for whom the work was familiar. She did not think particularly about him then. She was thinking about her father's letter, and the £40, and the 6 months, and whether either of those numbers would hold. Lady Ashford received her the following morning in the drawing-room, which was a room of great polish and considered arrangement. Every object in it had been placed to communicate something about its owner's standing, from the matched pair of Chinese vases on the mantelpiece to the particular angle of the settee which permitted the lady seated upon it to look slightly downward at anyone entering from the door. Lady Ashford was a woman of 55 or so, dressed in the manner of someone who had never permitted fashion to get entirely ahead of her, with grey-streaked hair arranged in a style that was 3 years past its moment, but carried with sufficient authority to seem like a choice rather than an oversight. She looked at Miriam for a long moment as though taking an inventory. "Your father writes that you read well," she said, "and that you have French and a reasonable hand." "Yes, my lady." "Can you manage correspondence without supervision?" "I can." "Good. I have a great deal of it." Lady Ashford set down her coffee cup with the small, decisive sound of a matter concluded. "You will sit with me in the mornings, attend the calls I indicate, and occupy yourself usefully otherwise. I do not require conversation beyond what I request. I am told you are not inclined to chatter." "I am not, my lady." "Then we shall manage." Miriam went back to her room and stood at the window and looked at the kitchen garden again, where the man in the brown coat was now moving along the far wall, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder with the easy habit of long familiarity. She managed. Through October she answered Lady Ashford's correspondence, accompanied her on morning calls to neighbouring families whose names Miriam committed carefully to memory, arranged the cut flowers for the drawing-room table 3 times a week, and read aloud on the evenings Lady Ashford requested it. She was not unkindly treated. She was not treated as a person of any particular significance either. She was a utility, well-maintained, appropriately invisible. Mrs. Pendle brought her tea without being asked, and occasionally stopped in the doorway of whatever room Miriam was working in, with the expression of a woman who had something to say and was deciding whether the time was right. The gardener was named Edmund. She learned this from one of the younger housemaids, Agnes, who mentioned it while showing Miriam where the flower-cutting scissors were kept in the scullery. Agnes had the cheerful confidence of someone who has assessed every member of the household and sorted them into categories, and Edmund had apparently been sorted into the category of steady and private, which Agnes communicated with a small raise of the eyebrows that suggested she found steadiness and privacy vaguely suspicious. The first proper conversation happened on a morning in the second week of October, when Miriam had gone out the kitchen garden to cut the last of the autumn Michaelmas daisies before the frost took them. Edmund was at the far end of the garden, doing something to the stone wall that Miriam could not identify from a distance, and as she worked along the daisy bed, she became aware that he had turned and was watching her with the quiet attention of a man who is not embarrassed to be caught looking. "You should take the outside stems first," he said. "The inner ones will hold another week if the frost stays light." She looked up. He was a few years older than her, she thought, with the lean bearing of someone who had spent a long time outdoors, and eyes that held steady in a way that most people's did not. His coat was old, his hands were clean. "Thank you," she said, and moved to the outside stems. He did not say anything further. He went back to the wall. She finished cutting and went inside and found herself thinking, without any particular reason, that he had offered the advice as a plain courtesy and expected nothing from it. She noticed that about him, the absence of expectation. Through October he passed her perhaps 4 times in the garden or at the edge of the East Drive, and each time he spoke in the same measured way, addressing her as Miss Holt, asking after nothing that was not immediately before them in the world. The weather. Whether the library had the particular volume on kitchen gardens he had once seen there. Whether the late chrysanthemums had survived the cold snap. He did not flatter her. He did not perform ease the way that men of good family often did when speaking to women they considered beneath their attention. He simply spoke and listened to the answer and moved on. The morning of the shawl came on a Tuesday in late October, a morning with a wind off the high ground to the north that had no interest in being polite about it. Miriam had come outside to collect a letter from the groom who served as the estate's go-between with the village post. and on her way back through the kitchen garden she found Edmund at the garden's central water pump, washing his hands in water that must have been close to freezing, without a coat. His coat was on the wall post, 15 feet away. She stopped. He looked up. She registered the visible effort it cost him to keep his hands moving steadily in that water. "Your coat is on the post," she said. "I know where it is," he said, but not unkindly. She looked at him for a moment. Then she unfastened the wool shawl from her own shoulders, the grey one that had been her mother's, and set it on the pump's edge within reach. "The wind is from the north," she said, as a statement of observable fact, and went inside. She did not look back. She did not know he was watching. She retrieved the shawl 2 days later. It had been folded with careful precision and left on the pump's edge, and there was a small sprig of dried lavender from the herb bed tucked into the fold. She stood holding it for a moment, then went inside without saying anything to anyone. Mrs. Pendle appeared in the corridor as she was going upstairs and looked at the shawl with a brief, quiet expression that said something Miriam could not quite read. In November, the arrangement changed. Lady Ashford announced it on a Thursday morning in the drawing room, during the hour Miriam spent taking dictation for the weekly correspondence. She set down the sheet she was reviewing and said, in the tone of someone producing news they expect to be received as welcome, that she had spoken with Thomas Vane regarding Miriam's position. Miriam kept her pen still on the page and waited. Thomas Vane was a widower of 41 or 42, a man with estates in the next county and an appetite for arrangement. He had come to Crestfield twice in October, both times arriving with a great deal of noise on the gravel approach and departing with the self-satisfaction of a man who has accomplished whatever he intended. Though what precisely he had accomplished, Miriam had not been certain. He was not cruel in any obvious fashion. He was careless. He looked at people the way he looked at furniture, assessing their utility without much curiosity about anything else. "Mr. Vane," Lady Ashford said, "is in need of a second wife, a capable woman of no great pretension. He has a daughter of 9 years who requires a firm hand, and his household has run without proper management since Mrs. Vane passed 18 months ago. He has inquired about you, particularly." "About me," Miriam said. "You have French and a good hand, and you do not chatter." Lady Ashford said this as though reciting the qualities of a competent piece of livestock. "He considers those adequate credentials, and your father's situation is known to him." Miriam set the pen down fully. "I was not aware," she said, "that my father's situation was a subject for Mr. Vane's consideration." "Your father owes £40 to this estate," Lady Ashford said, without any particular heat. "Mr. Vane is aware of the arrangement under which you are here. It is not a complicated matter, Miriam. A sensible match, a comfortable situation, and your father's debt resolved without further concern." Miriam looked at her hands on the writing desk for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and asked, evenly, what the next letter required, and Lady Ashford returned to dictation as though the previous exchange had been about the weather. The thing about an overheard conversation is that the door is never entirely the problem. The problem is the corridor, and the way that voices carry through stone passages when the speaker believes herself alone. Miriam was coming back from the linen room on the second floor of the East Wing, 3 days after the Vane announcement, when she heard Lady Ashford's voice from behind the partially open library door. Lady Ashford was speaking to someone, and the someone, from the measured responses, was Mrs. Pendle. "She is adequate," Lady Ashford was saying. "Adequate for Vane's purposes, certainly. He does not require anything more refined. He wants a woman who will manage his house and not require managing herself. Miss Holt will do." Mrs. Pendle's response was low, and Miriam could not make out the words precisely. "No," Lady Ashford said, and her tone had the flat certainty of someone who has not been argued with successfully in a long time. She has nothing else available to her. Her father is a debtor. Her family has no connection of any consequence. She is presentable and she is capable, and she is 23 years old, which is already past the easiest moment. Vane's offer is more than she has any reason to expect, and she is not in a position to be particular. She is material for a second wife, Pendle. Nothing more and nothing less. Miriam stood in the corridor for a moment, her hand on the wall, feeling the cold of the plaster under her palm. Then she walked past the library door, past the staircase and down to the far end of the east wing, where her room was, and she stood at her window and looked at the kitchen garden. Edmund was not there. The garden was empty in the grey afternoon light, the turned beds dark against the pale gravel paths. She had known, in the abstract, what her position in this house was. She had known that she was here as a utility, that her father's £40 and her French and her good hand were the whole of what the world currently had to say about her worth. She had told herself that she understood this. She had not, until this moment, entirely felt it. She was standing at the window with her hands clasped in front of her, quite still, when Mrs. Pendle appeared in the doorway behind her. "The fire's gone low," Mrs. Pendle said, and went to the hearth without waiting to be invited and began to build it up. She worked in silence for a moment, and then she said, without turning around, "I did not agree with what she said." "I know," Miriam said. "She does not see," Mrs. Pendle said, "what some others see." Miriam did not ask her to explain. She thanked her, and Mrs. Pendle went, and Miriam sat down at the small desk near the window and wrote a letter to her father. Not about the Vane arrangement, about the orchard and the frost, and whether the Michaelmas daisies at the rectory had survived the cold. She sealed it and set it aside for the post, and did not cry, and was rather proud of herself for it. Over the following 2 weeks, she was surprised to find that the estate grounds, which she had used primarily as a route between the house's various practical requirements, had become the place she most wanted to be. Not because anything extraordinary happened in them, because of the quality of the quiet. Edmund was usually somewhere on the grounds in the morning, and they had developed, without any formal agreement, a habit of occupying the same spaces in a way that permitted conversation without requiring it. She sat on the stone bench near the walled garden with the book she had taken from the library, and he worked along the late autumn beds, and occasionally one of them said something, and the other responded. And the silence between the remarks was the kind that does not create any pressure to fill it. She mentioned once that the botanical illustration volumes were excellent. He said he had read them, twice. She looked up. He was examining a rose cutting with the focused attention he gave everything, and he did not look up as he said it, and she did not remark on the oddness of a gardener reading botanical illustration twice, except to say that the second reading was generally the useful one. "Yes," he said. "You see the thing itself the first time. The second time you see what the author was trying to say about it." She held that in her mind for several days afterward. There was an afternoon in the library when the rain came in hard off the North Hills and made the garden impossible, and they both arrived at the library door from different directions at the same moment. He stepped back to let her through. She said it was raining. He agreed that it was. They went to separate parts of the library, and for 2 hours the only sounds were the rain against the old glass and the occasional turning of pages. She was reading a volume of natural history. He was reading something she could not make out the title of from her angle. Once he turned toward the window to catch the light, and she saw his profile against the grey afternoon. And there was something in the set of his jaw and the line of his shoulders that she had noticed before and could not account for. He looked, she had thought more than once, as though he were accustomed to a different kind of room. She dismissed the thought as fanciful and went back to her natural history. He said before she left that the second volume of the series was better than the first, and she said she would find it, and he said it was on the third shelf from the south wall, which it was, exactly where he said it would be. She did not ask how he knew the library's shelving that precisely. She should have. The estate dinner was Lady Ashford's annual occasion for gathering the neighbouring families, and this year it carried underneath its usual surface of dressed rooms and ordered courses the additional purpose of Thomas Vane. He arrived on the appointed evening in a carriage that announced itself on the gravel with considerable emphasis, and came into the hallway with the bearing of a man who has made up his mind about something and is waiting for the formalities to confirm it. He found Miriam almost immediately, which took no great effort since she was standing precisely where she had been directed to stand, near the foot of the stairs in the entry hall. And he looked at her with the direct assessment of a man inspecting something he has agreed to purchase. "Miss Holt," he said, "you look well." "Thank you, Mr. Vane." "Lady Ashford tells me you're sensible. I value a sensible woman. My daughter requires a firm hand." "So I understand," Miriam said. He nodded, as though she had agreed to something. She had not. There were 9 people at dinner. Miriam knew 5 of them. Lady Ashford and Mrs. Pendle, who served as the dinner's principal managing force from the doorway, a neighbouring baronet and his wife who came every year and whose names were Sir Robert and Lady Corley, and Edmund, who arrived at the dining-room threshold in a coat that was not the brown working coat, but something dark and well-pressed that she had not seen before, and sat at the table's far end with the particular composure of a man who is used to being in rooms like this one. She did not understand why he was at the table. She assumed Lady Ashford had some reason and did not pursue it further. The dinner proceeded through its courses. Vane sat to Miriam's left and spent the soup course explaining his estate's new drainage arrangements, and the fish course explaining his late wife's failings in the matter of household management. And Miriam ate her soup and her fish, and listened and gave him the minimum reply that courtesy required. Across the table, Sir Robert was telling Lady Ashford about a dispute over fencing rights with the next parish, and Lady Corley was examining the dinner service with the concentrated interest of a woman building a comparative assessment. At the far end of the table, Edmund ate in the manner of a man who is not particularly attending to the company, which is to say that he was attending to all of it, very quietly. During the game course, Vane turned to Miriam and said, in a lowered voice, but not low enough, "I spoke to Lady Ashford this morning. I think we can consider the matter settled." Miriam set down her fork. "I do not consider it settled," she said. Vane looked at her. "I beg your pardon." "I do not consider the matter settled," she said again in the same level voice. "I have not agreed to anything, Mr. Vane. I was not present when the arrangement was discussed. My name was involved without my consent, and my father's debt was used as the instrument of my persuasion, and I understand very well the position I am in. I understand that I have very little standing in this room." She kept her voice steady. "But I have not agreed, and I will not be agreed on my behalf." The table had gone quiet in the way that tables at estate dinners go quiet, which is with the particular suppressed attention of 8 people pretending they have heard nothing while hearing everything. Lady Ashford's colour had risen. Vane opened his mouth. From the far end of the table, very quietly, came a sound. Not a voice precisely. A chair drawn back from the table. And then Edmund stood up, and the room underwent a change that Miriam could not immediately account for, because it was not the standing up itself that caused it. It was the way he stood, the way a man stands when he has decided something, and is no longer in the business of postponing it. The steward, a compact grey-haired man named Hollis, who managed Crestfield's practical affairs, was standing near the sideboard. He had come in during the game course with a matter requiring Lady Ashford's attention and had been waiting for the appropriate moment, a letter in his hand, bearing a seal. He looked at Edmund standing at the far end of the table, and something shifted in Hollis's face. "My lord," Hollis said, not loudly, but with the unmistakable precision of long-established habit. The room went still, not quiet in the way it had been quiet a moment ago, the suppressed attention of polished company pretending not to listen. Still, in the way that a room goes still when the thing everyone thought they understood turns out to be something else entirely. Miriam looked at Edmund. He was looking at her. "Hollis," Edmund said, "you may bring whatever that letter requires, but not at this moment." Hollis withdrew, with the discreet efficiency of a man who has understood his timing was inexact. Sir Robert Corley set down his wineglass very carefully. "Good God," Sir Robert said. "Edmund Ashford, I thought you were in Italy until March." Lady Corley made a small sound that communicated considerable social processing occurring at speed. Lady Ashford had not moved. She was sitting at the head of the table with the particular stillness of someone whose understanding of the last several weeks is undergoing a rapid and uncomfortable revision. "Edmund," she said. Her voice was careful and deliberate. "You might have said." "I might have," he said. He looked down the table at Miriam, whose hands were flat on the white linen cloth in front of her, whose face was very still. "I chose not to." Vane pushed his chair back. He did it with the energy of a man reassessing a room he thought he had understood. He looked at Edmund, he looked at Lady Ashford, he looked at Miriam. Whatever calculation he was running was not taking long. "I was not aware," he said in the general direction of Lady Ashford, "that the Earl of Crestfield was in residence." "Neither," Lady Ashford said thinly, "was I, in any practical sense." "I arrived in September," Edmund said, "and found the house running well enough without an announcement. I was content to observe." He paused. "I have now observed sufficiently." The room was still working through what had been said in the previous several minutes, including what Miriam had said before the room went still. Miriam herself was sitting with the letter of it unfolding slowly in her mind, the pieces of the past 2 months assembling into a different shape. The brown coat, the precise knowledge of the library's shelves, the way he moved through the estate with the ease of a man who had grown up in its rooms. The botanical illustrations read twice. Edmund had moved down the length of the table and was standing now, not at Lady Ashford's end, but at a neutral point that addressed the room without claiming it. He looked at Vane with the quiet directness that Miriam had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he had decided about. "The arrangement you were discussing," Edmund said, "with Lady Ashford, the one involving Miss Holt." Vane's chin lifted slightly. "What of it?" "It will not proceed." Vane absorbed this with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to argue and arriving at the correct answer. The correct answer was that one did not argue with an earl in his own dining room in front of Sir Robert Corley and Lady Corley and 4 other witnesses when the earl had just made himself known after 2 months of knowing everything. The arithmetic of it was not complicated. "As you say," Vane said. He sat down, though he did not look comfortable. Lady Ashford said nothing. She was looking at the empty space in front of her plate with the expression of a woman who is recalculating the events of the last 8 weeks and finding that several of them cast her in a light she does not care for. She had described Miriam in the library 3 weeks ago as material for a second wife, nothing more. She had dictated in Miriam's presence the case for Miriam's social worthlessness. She had used a £40 debt as a mechanism of coercion in a house where her son had been present the entire time. She did not say any of this aloud. She picked up her wineglass and set it down and looked at the table. Sir Robert cleared his throat and said something about the quality of the claret, which was the social equivalent of opening a window in a warm room, and the table accepted the offer, and conversation resumed in the particular determined fashion of company that has agreed collectively to normalize. Miriam ate the remainder of her dinner. Mrs. Pendle, passing the dining-room doorway an hour later with the evening tea tray, permitted herself a single expression that no one but the corridor wall witnessed. Vane departed the following morning. He came into the entry hall at 9 o'clock with his bags already on the carriage and shook Lady Ashford's hand with the briskness of a man who has decided to treat the previous evening as a minor inconvenience and move on. He nodded to Miriam. She returned the nod. He went down the steps and the gravel announced his departure with its customary emphasis. And then he was gone. Lady Ashford stood in the entry hall for a moment after the carriage sound faded, and then she said, without looking at Miriam, "You may wish to know that the £40 will not be called in." "Thank you, my lady," Miriam said. There was a long pause. "I was not," Lady Ashford said, and stopped. Started again. "I was not aware of the full circumstances." The words had the quality of something being placed on a table with deliberate care, not fluently. Had I been, certain things would have been conducted differently. Miriam understood that this was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that Lady Ashford's vocabulary could produce. She received it in the spirit it was offered, which was as a small and difficult thing. "I understand, my lady," she said. Lady Ashford went upstairs. Miriam went to the library. Edmund found her there an hour later, standing at the third shelf from the south wall with the second volume of the Natural History series in her hands. She had not been reading it. She had been standing with it, thinking. He came into the library and closed the door behind him and stood near the centre of the room, and they looked at each other across the space between them with the unguarded directness of two people who have run out of reasons for indirection. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I came back from Italy in September," he said, intending to see what the house had become while I was away. "My father died 3 years ago. I was abroad for most of the time since. I came home and found the house running and my mother in full command of it, and I thought I would watch for a while before declaring myself." He paused. "And then you arrived." Miriam set the book down on the shelf. "And then I arrived. I wanted to see," he said, "whether the house would show you as it showed me, whether you were as you seemed when no one of consequence was attending." He looked at her steadily. "You were." She thought of the cold water and the grey shawl and the lavender sprig in the fold. She thought of the library afternoons and the autumn beds and the outside stems of the Michaelmas daisies. She thought of everything that had been, apparently, witnessed. "It is not a comfortable thing," she said, "to discover one has been observed." "No," he said. "I imagine not. I'm sorry for it." She considered him for a moment. The old library around them was warm with the mid-morning fire, the shelves close and familiar now, the light from the east windows, the same uncertain grey-white. It had been on the morning she found the note. She thought of the note. "There is something I need to ask you," she said. He waited. "The note," she said, "in the library, folded between the botanical illustration volumes. I found it last week." She kept her voice level. "It has my name in it." Something crossed his face. Not surprise, exactly. Something quieter. "My father was a naturalist," he said. "Among other things, he wrote a great deal in this library. Notes, observations, letters to correspondents in Edinburgh and Rome. After he died, I found one he had written to me among his papers about the estate, about what he hoped for it. He had a particular idea about the kind of person who should preside over Crestfield. He crossed to the third shelf and moved his hand along the spines without hesitation, and drew out a different volume from the one she had retrieved the note from. He opened it to the back cover, and inside the back cover was folded a letter, much longer than the note she had found, and he held it out. She took it. The letter was from Edmund's father, addressed to Edmund, dated 5 years earlier. It spoke about the estate and the house and what it meant to manage them honestly. And near the end, in the careful way of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say, it spoke about the kind of woman who was suited to such a place. Not a woman of great family, it said. Not a woman whose dowry would excuse everything else. A woman who would offer water to the gardener on a cold morning. A woman who would speak plainly to someone she believed had nothing to give her. The last line said, quite simply, that he hoped Edmund would know her when he found her, and that her name was Miriam. Miriam read it twice. She stood very still for a moment in the old library, with the fire low and the grey light at the windows, and the weight of the letter in her hands. "Your father wrote this 5 years ago," she said. "Yes." "He did not know me." "He knew," Edmund said, "what he was looking for." She considered this. The first wife's note, the one she had found between the botanical illustrations, had been written by Edmund's father's first wife, Edmund's mother, from before Lady Ashford. She had used the library's natural history collection, apparently, and had left her own small note tucked away. And that note's third line, which contained Miriam's name, had been a coincidence of naming that had taken her 3 days to puzzle out. Edmund's father had spoken of the woman he hoped for by that name, not as a specific person, but as a type, a particular quality of woman. He had called her Miriam, which was a name that meant beloved in the old tradition, and he had meant it the way that letters meant things before they became particular. She understood it now. She folded both letters, the one she had found and the one Edmund had produced, and she held them together in her hand, and she looked at him. He was standing near the window with the morning light behind him, and he looked precisely as he had looked on the morning she first saw him from her window, working the autumn beds with the unhurried precision of someone entirely at home in his own ground. Except that he was not the gardener. He had never been only the gardener. He had been the Earl of Crestfield in a worn brown coat, tending his own earth with the same plain care that he had brought to everything. She had thought, more than once, that he looked as though he were accustomed to a different kind of room. He had been. "You knew me by a quality," she said. "Not by my name. By what I saw," he said, which became, in time, the same thing. She looked at the letters in her hand and then at the room around her, the familiar library with its close shelves and its botanical illustrations and its view of the kitchen garden where the winter beds were already turned and waiting for March. The fire that Mrs. Pendle had built up this morning was burning steadily. Outside, in the corridor, the house was going about its ordinary morning business. She had come here in September with 1 trunk and 2 hat boxes, and her father's letter, and the understanding that she was adequate material for whatever purpose the arrangement required. She had been observed. She had been measured. She had been found by the one person whose measurement of her the house had apparently been waiting to confirm, to be something other than adequate. She was not certain what the next several weeks would require of either of them. There were things to be said and things to be arranged, and she suspected a conversation between Edmund and his mother that would be longer and less comfortable than the one over the dinner table. There was her father's £40, which Lady Ashford had said would not be called in, and she intended to hold that commitment firmly. There were 6 months of a companion arrangement that had already been set in motion, and she did not yet know what shape the completion of them would take. These were problems with solutions. She was not afraid of them. She set the 2 letters down on the writing desk beside her, the one written by the first wife of the estate, and the one written by a father to his son about what he hoped the son would find. She smoothed the paper with her fingers. Then she crossed to the window and looked out at the kitchen garden in the November morning, the turned beds dark and patient, the stone paths pale against them. Behind her, Edmund said nothing. He was very good at the particular kind of silence that did not press. After a while, she said, "The outside stems first." "Yes," he said. She heard rather than saw the small shift in him that was a thing releasing, the way that something held carefully for a long time finally sets down its weight. She stayed at the window for a moment longer, her hands at her sides, looking at the garden she had looked at every morning since September. The winter light was cold and clear. The limes along the drive stood bare against the sky, their old branches precise and still. Somewhere in the kitchen, the morning went quietly on. The note lay on the desk behind her. She had found her name in it, and she had found, underneath the name, the thing it had been reaching toward all along. She was not, as it happened, material for a second wife. She was what the house had been waiting for,